You're listening to the Daily Sales Tips Podcast, and I'm your host, Scott Ingram. This is turning into a little 3-part mini-series because I wanted to share another clip from my conversation with Dalia Cote from the Sales Success Stories podcast. The story and the tip here is pretty self-contained, so let's just get into it.
I actually shared this story with David, and I've shared it on LinkedIn in a few places, but 3 years ago, after making the jump from SDR to AE, and after about a year of slugging it out with very little success, I was caught in a round of layoffs and I was let go, right? I was struggling to stay afloat, both professionally and financially. And I actually started thinking that maybe sales wasn't for me after all. I'd been incredibly successful, as an SDR, but maybe I just wasn't cut out for that closing role. And I was really ready to hang up that headset. And I actually started applying for roles outside of sales. And then, a funny thing happened. I stumbled across this podcast, the Sales Success Story podcast, and specifically the episode with David Weiss. I think it's episode 24. And it really struck a nerve with me, right? It really fundamentally changed the way that I was thinking about selling. And David, in the podcast, for those people that haven't listened to it, I highly, highly recommend you check it out. He outlined how his approach had helped him become, right, the number one seller in his division at ADP, but how his process was teachable, right? It was learnable. He claimed anyone could do it. So I listened to that over and over, and I got this nagging feeling to give it another shot. And I took another AE role and I dove in and I became a true student of sales, right? I implemented my top 3, which I'm sure we're going to dive into in more detail today, and improved every single step of my process. And the results started coming, right? In 2018, I hit quota for the first time. In 2019, I was the number one seller in the company, which is that same year that the company became the 13th fastest growing tech company here in Canada. And I broke a number of company records along the way.
That's awesome. I love that end-to-end story. It's exactly why I started these podcasts and why I wanted to have these conversations, right? It was to do exactly what you described, which is, hey, I want to be successful. I have the desire. And, sure, you can read books and you can listen to other podcasts by folks who are telling you what to do, but I think it's different to hear the real world experience of the people who are actually doing it and actually doing it right now and being able to implement those strategies. And I know one of the other things that you talked about in one of the notes that I saw, maybe it was the LinkedIn post or maybe it was the note that you sent to David when you guys actually connected, was, you kind of wore out the clip that I had pulled out where he talks about the MedPick process. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone's listening to this and hasn't or doesn't know what MedPick is or hasn't even listened to that, I would highly recommend doing it. I have been hard pressed to find anything that's nearly as succinct and valuable and easy to implement as the process that David outlined when he was explaining MedPick. But for me, that was actually the first time that I came across it. And I had read a lot about different sales methodologies, and I certainly had spent a lot of time trying to implement them internally, but I didn't really have anything, coming back to my top 3, I didn't really have a system that truly worked for me. So I think it's the second most watched video that you have, David's MedPick overview. I probably account for a large number of those views alone, but I would recommend, if you haven't watched it, probably pause this right now, go listen to that. It's so incredibly helpful.
To complete this mini-series tomorrow, I'm going to play that clip of David Weiss explaining the MedPick sales process that has driven so much of his own success, his team's success, and the success of others like Dal. But if you're impatient, I'll have a link to the clip for you, as well as links to connect with Dal and David at dailysales.tips/466. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow.